In the different languages of the thousands of people he ruled, he had many names: Carolus Magnus, Karl the Gross, Charlemagne. But all these names meant only one thing: Charles the Great. Even in his own time he was viewed as a hero, an inspired conqueror, an enlightened ruler, and something of a savior. For a long period of European history, dating from the fall of the Roman Empire to the beginning of the Renaissance 1,000 years later, Charlemagne was the only great presence. Throughout these years, barbarians roamed across Europe. Christianity made slow progress. People lived in wretched conditions of poverty and filth, illness and plague was widespread, and human learning seemed to have come to a complete stop. Historians call it the Dark Ages. But if there was one spark of light in that darkness, it was Charlemagne and his brilliant court. When Charlemagne was born, he inherited from his father a part of what is called the Frankish Empire, or Frankland, about half of modern France and the Low Countries of Belgium and the Netherlands. Yet by the end of his career, he had led his armies through Italy, Germany, and Spain, and conquered half the continent of Europe. He founded the first empire in Western Europe after the fall of Rome, and his court became the center of a cultural rebirth on the continent. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned the new Roman Empire in an elaborate ceremony in Rome that marked the birth of what we refer to now as the Holy Roman Empire. He was, like most conquerors, a complex man who by modern standards would seem full of contradictions. Charlemagne was thoughtful, deeply religious, and committed to the improvement of his own mind. Yet he could be savage and merciless in defeating his enemies, punishing traitors or forcing pagans to convert to Christianity. He was devoted to the welfare and benefit of his subjects, yet he ruled them with rigid, absolute power and tolerated no opposition. He murdered thousands, yet was so attached to his family he couldn't bear it when his children were away. He protected and promoted Christianity with all the strength he had, was one of history's greatest patrons of the arts, literature, and education, yet he could order a man beheaded for the most minor of crimes without blinking an eye. As Alexander the Great and Augustus Caesar before him, Charlemagne brought unity to a vast area that had known only chaos and strife. He then established a glorious culture that far surpassed any other of its time. The unified Europe he created lasted only a short time, barely past his death, but the culture he had fostered went on to change the history of Europe and even the world. Charlemagne was born around April 2nd in the year 742, the son of Pippin the Short, king of the Franks. Nothing is known of his childhood, but he must have received a solid education, for he later became a considerable scholar. For a long time, historians believed he was illiterate and practiced for many hours as an adult trying to learn to write. But this was taken from a biography of the time, written by one of his friends, which said only that he kept a slate and copybooks under his pillow so that he could practice his hand at shaping letters. The friend wrote, he did not get far because he'd begun too late in life. Now many historians think the biographer was referring to Charlemagne's attempts to learn calligraphy, the fine, elegant script in which manuscripts of the time were written. There was a beautiful new form of calligraphy that developed under Charlemagne's reign called Carolingian minuscule that became the basis of printed letters still used today. The monks had developed this script into a fine art, and Charlemagne was probably trying to master it himself. As a child, Charlemagne was seldom in one place for very long. His father was constantly picking up his court and traveling from palace to palace throughout his empire. Although the royal houses were called palaces, they little resembled palaces of past and future empires, and were really nothing more than large farms. The court would move from one farm to another, using up the resources of each, then continuing on to the next. These estates were the total of King Pippin's wealth. There was as yet no system of taxation. He traveled to find the food and supplies he needed, and also to administer justice and check on his officials. Travel was slow and uncomfortable in Charlemagne's youth. The great Roman roads had been reduced to muddy trails, in which the ox carts frequently became stuck or overturned. Later, when he was king, Charlemagne would take a continuing interest in the state of the roads in his realm. At home, Charlemagne spoke German, but he also knew a crude form of Latin that was rapidly developing into French. He knew the formal Latin that was used in all writing and had some knowledge of Greek. He attended a special school in his father's court and took additional lessons from an abbot. Subjects he studied must have included grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, astronomy, and geometry, for he could later discuss all these topics at length with the intellectuals he invited to his court. He had an active, questioning mind in almost every field of human learning. In 768, when Charlemagne was 26, his father died and left his kingdom equally divided between Charlemagne and his brother Carolan, with the hopes that his wife, the Queen Bertrada, could mediate any disputes between them. One of the first things she did was arrange a marriage between Charlemagne and a Lombard princess to alleviate tensions between the Frankish and Lombard kingdoms. Charles already had a wife, but neither he nor his mother thought this should stand in the way, since there were good grounds for divorce. The wife, Himiltrud, was a commoner. There were questions about the legality of the marriage, and she had borne him only a son who was a hunchback, and therefore was not qualified to inherit the throne. The new marriage plans, however, were violently criticized by the Pope, who didn't want to see an alliance between the Franks, who were loyal Christians, and the Lombards, who were enemies of the Church. In language bound to intimidate even the most stout-hearted, the Pope wrote to Charlemagne that St. Peter himself, Prince of the Apostles, guardian of the keys to the kingdom of heaven, by all that is lawful, by the living and true God, by the ineffable divine omnipotence, by the tremendous day of judgment, by all the divine mysteries, adjures you not to wed her, or be doomed with the devil and his most wicked ministers and all impious men to eternal flames. That seemed to do the trick, and Charlemagne canceled his wedding. His devotion to the church was only part of his decision, however. He had meanwhile taken a fancy to someone else, a Frankish girl named Hildegard, who was little more than a child. By the time his life was over, Charlemagne had married 5 times, but it was Hildegard and the 5 daughters and 4 sons she bore him that formed the central family he loved devotedly. Some said he loved this family even more than he loved conquest and power. Only a few years after his father had died, Charlemagne's brother also died, making him the sole ruler of the kingdom of the Franks, all of present-day France, Belgium, the Netherlands, western Germany, and parts of Switzerland. He was now in control of a great deal of wealth and a strong military organization, which he would use to double the territory under his control. As his first order of business, he decided to attend the northern border, which was constantly under threat of invasion by the Saxons. The Saxons of Europe were relatives of the Saxons who conquered Britain in the 2 centuries before Charlemagne. They were non-Christians, pagans who worshipped a whole variety of gods in sacred groves that were as holy to them as churches were to the Christians. But some of their customs were shocking to the Christians, including occasional human sacrifices and ritual cannibalism. Worse yet, they considered the settlements of their Christian neighbors a good source for pillage and plunder, and took particular delight in burning their churches to the ground and slaughtering their priests and missionaries. Now that his kingdom was united under his rulership, Charlemagne decided it was time to end the years of Saxon terrorism. The campaign against the Saxons was the longest ordeal of Charlemagne's reign. It took him 30 years to finally subdue them, even though he attacked almost every year and launched 18 major campaigns against them. His first campaign, shortly after he became king, was a victory from start to finish. Charlemagne marched so quickly with such a large army that the Saxons were caught unprepared. He and his men spent an entire summer avenging their kingdom by burning and pillaging Saxon villages all across the north. When he was 32, Charlemagne then decided to cross the Alps and subdue the Lombards in the north of Italy, a group that had tried to conquer Rome and was a constant threat to the Pope. When the Pope appealed to the Franks for help, Charlemagne didn't hesitate. He inflicted a series of decisive defeats, proclaimed himself king of Lombardy, and then marched into Rome victorious, where he was greeted by a grateful Pope and throngs of cheering citizens. Next, he turned his armies east and headed for the territories in Germany known as Bavaria, which were still not part of his empire. The Bavarians, who were made up of several different tribes, most of them pagan, were also easily defeated. By the time he was 58, Charlemagne was in control of a realm that stretched from central Italy north to Denmark, and from eastern Germany west to the Atlantic. Throughout it all, he followed a policy of friendship with the Christian Church, protected its power, and saw himself with almost the divine destiny of spreading the Christian faith throughout Europe, a monumental task at which he completely succeeded. With Germany conquered, Charlemagne marched south to try and push back the Arabs in Spain, and claimed that country for the Franks and for Christianity. But he abandoned his campaign when he heard the Saxons were gathering a large army on his northern border again. He raced back to Frankland, leaving his army to catch up later. On the return to Frankland from Spain, Charlemagne's army took part in a small battle that was destined to become one of the most famous in history. In August of 778, his forces marched through a pass in the Pyrenees Mountains called Roncesvalles. Basques hiding in the mountains waited until the army was almost entirely through the narrow pass, then attacked from the rear. They fired arrows from atop the mountains and rolled huge stones down upon the Franks, whose heavy armor kept them from making a swift escape. In the battle that followed, the Basques killed the Franks almost to the last man, including some of Charlemagne's most important generals and nobles. The dramatic battle at Roncesvalles, in the shadows of the towering mountain peaks, and with the heroism of a struggle to the last man, captured the imagination of the public and of artists and writers for many centuries later. 60 years after the battle, a writer commented that he didn't need to list the names of the dead because everybody had already memorized them. During the next 3 centuries, the story of Roncesvalles was pieced together by minstrels into the Song of Roland, one of the greatest works of medieval literature. The hero of the story, Roland, was a Frankish soldier who died in the battle. This excerpt from the Song of Roland describes Charlemagne's grief when he returns to the pass to find the enemy has fled and all that remains is to bury his dead. In Roncesvalles, Charles now has set his feet, and for the dead he finds begins to weep. He sees his nephew lying on the green grass. No wonder, then, that Charles is full of wrath. Dismounts and goes to him, his heart is sad. He holds the count between his 2 hands, and on the body faints, so sharp's the pang. My friend Roland, God lay your soul on flowers, in paradise with all the glorious host. You came to Spain with a cruel overlord. No day shall pass thenceforth, I'll not mourn. By the time the battle at Roncesvalles occurred, Hildegard, the girl bride whom Charlemagne had married, had given him 4 sons, Charles, Caroline, and twins named Louis and Lothar, of whom only Louis survived. At his famous court in Aachen was also Pippin the Hunchback, the child of the first wife he divorced, and several daughters. Charlemagne delighted in his large family and began to devote his attention to creating the atmosphere of a proper court at his palace. He also began to concentrate on the domestic affairs and living conditions in his country. At the time, the society of the Franks was typical of the medieval age. All literacy and learning was concentrated among the clergy and kept alive only in monasteries. In an attempt to revitalize his culture, Charlemagne first started with himself. He took lessons in astronomy and music, studied the Bible, and gathered around him a group of established scholars and artists. These included poets, grammarians, astronomers, mathematicians, musicians, architects, theologians, philosophers, painters, gold and silversmiths, ivory carvers, sculptors, and manuscript copiers. They had the quaint habit of addressing themselves by nicknames taken from classic or spiritual traditions. One poet was known as Pindar, and another writer called Homer. Charlemagne himself adopted the name David after King David. The biggest star in this celestial grouping of intellect and creativity was an Englishman named Alcuin, who was probably the finest scholar of his age, and certainly the greatest teacher. He had a special gift for firing a desire for learning in his students, who were scattered all across Europe and England and were devoted to him. Alcuin became a friend, teacher, and unofficial minister of education for Charlemagne. He conducted the palace school, expanded the schools and monasteries and cathedrals throughout the country, founded a library, edited and wrote textbooks, increased the copying of manuscripts, and tried to set up free education for all boys in the land. It was Alcuin who helped develop the Carolingian minuscule, the calligraphy Charlemagne tried so hard to learn that became the standard for manuscripts of the time. Today, much of what we know of the ancient world is due to Charlemagne and Alcuin in their efforts in furthering the work of copyists. 90% of Latin writings have been passed down to us through their Carolingian manuscripts. The word Carolingian was taken from Alcuin's name, and the period in which he and Charlemagne revitalized Europe is often referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne wasn't lost in the world of intellect and art, however. He also took an energetic interest in the practical concerns of his kingdom. In his time, Europe had hardly any towns, trade, or industry. Almost everyone made their living by farming, and they raised barely enough to feed themselves. The government and laws of the old Roman Empire had disappeared, and settlements were scattered sparsely about, with little communication or unity. Charlemagne had the deplorable roads rebuilt, and he constructed bridges paid for by tolls. He granted large estates to nobles, who in return provided him with military and political services. It was the duty of these nobles to maintain the roads and fortifications on their land, an arrangement that led to the system of feudalism that dominated Europe for the next 400 years. The large manor houses or villas Charlemagne relied on were completely reorganized. He paid close attention to every detail of daily life and reformed almost all of them. He issued decrees that forbade stewards of the manors to cheat the peasants, that required buildings to be maintained, and that food be prepared in conditions of utmost cleanliness. He introduced the stewards to bookkeeping, regulated beekeeping, fruit-raising, and seed selection, stocked the fish ponds, and even made a list of 74 vegetables and herbs he wanted grown. It's said that Charlemagne created the great French wine Corton Charlemagne when he found that red wine stained his white beard, and ordered that white grapes be planted instead. Because he couldn't be everywhere in his kingdom, particularly in the days when travel was so difficult, Charlemagne employed emissaries who were each assigned an area in the kingdom and were responsible for its welfare. This use of emissaries was one of the greatest innovations of his reign, and allowed him to govern his vast territories fairly and efficiently. The emissaries reported to him directly about the needs and problems in each territory, and he then took action to correct them. Charlemagne was devoted to justice and decreed that all courts be held regularly and the judges based their decisions only on accepted law. He made sure the traditional laws of his people were honored, even though these people represented many different cultures and backgrounds. There were Romans, Franks, Saxons, Lombards, Bavarians, Jews, and different tribal groups, all of whom were allowed to keep their own local codes and laws, as long as they didn't violate Christianity or the emperor. He strongly encouraged the development of Jewish communities, because he felt they contributed to trade, and he invited Jewish scholars to his court at Aachen. Under his reign, diversity not only survived, it flourished. Meanwhile, there was still the problem of the Saxons. Year after year, Charlemagne had been returning to Saxony, advancing farther with each campaign, forcing conquered Saxons to be baptized and drafting their men into his army. By now, most Saxons were putting up little resistance, but there was one determined rebel named Widukind, who led a national uprising in 782, when Charlemagne was 40 years old. This uprising led to the cruelest and most dishonorable act of Charlemagne's career. By the time Charlemagne arrived at the scene of battle, half his army had been wiped out. Saxon soldiers had deserted, and the rest of his men had been killed, including 2 of his best generals. But just like at Roncesvalles, he found no enemy upon which to exact his revenge. The Saxon army had disbanded and could no longer be distinguished from the local population. Furious and frustrated, Charlemagne summoned all his officials of Saxony to meet him at Verden, near the German city of Bremen. He then demanded to know the names of all the leaders in the rebellion, and managed to get the Saxons to denounce each other. 4,500 noblemen and commoners were sentenced to death, and he had them all beheaded in a single day. This day, known as the Slaughter of the Saxons, was to haunt Charlemagne the rest of his life. Many of his own people began to fear him, and even to plot against him, and the Saxons, far from being frightened into submission, were so filled with hatred for the Franks that their resistance continued another 20 years. After the savagery at Verden, it almost seemed as if a curse had been put on Charlemagne. The next spring, his wife Hildegard died in childbirth, and the baby, a daughter, died not long after. A few months later, his mother died. Charlemagne remarried to a woman named Fastrada, but she was never accepted by the public, which somehow blamed her for the cruelty Charlemagne displayed during the continuing warfare against the Saxons. Once he had achieved success and signed a treaty with the Saxons, he imposed a reign of terror on them, in spite of all the pleadings of his advisers that he show leniency. He ordered the death penalty for any violation of Christian principles, any offense against a priest or church, even for eating meat during Lent or for cremating the dead, as was traditional in pagan cultures. Already destitute from years of war, the Saxons were required to pay heavy taxes, and to finance the churches Charlemagne forced them to build. At home, too, the people were tired of taxes and the burdens of war. There were plots to overthrow Charlemagne, including one that involved his own son, Pippin the Hunchback. In every case, the traitors were executed, except Pippin, who was confined to a monastery for life. The only real peace and happiness Charlemagne had in these days was at home with his beloved family. During the later years of his life, Charlemagne kept his court at Aachen and seldom moved it about. His day started early, and he was working almost from the moment he arose. While he dressed, he had officials, contestants in legal suits, and citizens with petitions in his chamber, all pleading their cases or making their reports. He always wore the same plain linen garments that his subjects wore, but he liked to dress his wives and daughters in splendid jewels and oriental silks, and even his horse was decked out in silver and gold. Charlemagne doted on his 5 daughters. They were so dear to him that he never allowed them to marry anyone far from home, so he could keep them close by. Even when a Byzantine emperor asked for the hand of one of his daughters, he said no. A poet who married Charlemagne's daughter, Bertha, described the girls on a hunt, starting with Charlemagne's favorite, Rotrud. Her pale blonde hair was intertwined with ribbons of velvet and strings of pearls. A coronet of gold encircled her head. Bertha was wearing a golden diadem, with golden filaments sparkling in her gleaming hair, her snowy shoulders covered by an ermine wrap, her belt shining in many colors. Then came lily-white Gisela, in a purple gown shot through with tints of mauve, her face, her hair gleaming with many lights. Then Rothade, on her breast, on her throat, among her hair flashed jewels of various sorts. A silk mantle drapes her white shoulders. Above her radiant forehead a coronet of pearls gleam. A gold pin mounted with a pearl crowns her coiffure. Finally came the teenager, Theotrade, with rare emeralds adorning her lovely neck. Hunting was a favorite pastime of Charlemagne and his family. He was renowned for his hunting skill, his swimming, his strength, and his courage in battle. Riding a horse was as natural to him as walking. He was a rare blend of both physical and intellectual prowess. Those who knew him described him as being over 6 feet tall with piercing eyes, fair hair, a thick neck, and a potbelly. The potbelly is a mystery, since he was known to be fond of exercise, and rode, hunted, or swam almost every day. A friend of Charlemagne's named Einhard, who lived at the court for about 17 years, left this description of his king. He had a broad and strong body of unusual height, but well proportioned, for his height measured 7 times his feet. His skull was round, the eyes were lively and rather large, the nose of more than average length, the hair gray but full, the face friendly and cheerful. Seating or standing, he thus made a dignified and stately impression, even though he had a thick, short neck and a belly that protruded somewhat. But this was hidden by the good proportions of the rest of his figure. He strode with firm step and held himself like a man. He spoke with a higher voice than one would have expected of someone of his build. He enjoyed good health except for being repeatedly plagued by fevers 4 years before his death. Toward the end, he dragged 1 foot. The force of Charlemagne's personality was such that one poet at court called him Rex Pater Europae, King Father of Europe. During meals at the palace, Charlemagne usually had poetry readings. There was little drinking, for he despised drunkenness, and according to his friend Alcuin, preferred the wine of learning. If there were no poets available for dinner, he would have someone read aloud from history books, or from his own favorite book, The City of God by St. Augustine. He was a deeply religious man, who even while his armies were marching over Europe, was cultivating the arts of peace and reforming the church. He always continued with his social reforms, building even more schools, establishing a system of weights and measures for his people, and developing a new monetary system. Alcuin described him as illuminated with the light of all knowledge, and claimed he could see through all that is mystery and darkness, down to the very bottom of things. And Alcuin was the most learned man of Europe, and a man with direct and honest opinions. Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope at Rome as Roman Emperor, in theory the successor to the line of emperors, headed by Augustus Caesar. He thus became the first emperor of what is called the Holy Roman Empire. In the 800s, as Charlemagne entered his 60s, 2 invaders swept down on his kingdom. One was the plague, which victimized Europe over and over for centuries, and the other was the Vikings, who were beginning to attack the edges of Charlemagne's empire. Expecting an invasion by the king of the Danes, Charlemagne marched his army back to Verdun, the same site where he executed 4,500 Saxons in 1 day, and was believed to have incurred the wrath of God. The curse of Verdun seemed to still hold. While he was there, Charlemagne heard of the deaths of his sister, his son, and his favorite daughter, Rotrude, probably from the plague. Animals, too, seemed to be falling victim to some widespread disease. The oxen used for transport and the cattle used for food were dying all over Europe. People became hysterical, and rumors circulated that some enemy was poisoning the wells. Mobs seized innocent citizens and threw them into rivers to drown. When the Danes failed to invade and Charlemagne headed back for home, a meteor streaked across the sky, causing his horse to rear. He was thrown to the ground so violently that he lost his sword and his cloak and suffered injury, an incident that bystanders all interpreted as an omen. The following year, the bad luck continued. His son Charles, heir to the throne, died and left no children of his own. In his grief, Charlemagne turned more and more to religion and less to the affairs of state. In the public squares of Frankland, his heralds read his latest decrees, which sounded more like they had been written by a bishop than a king. Be humble and kind to one another. Envy, hatred, and violence keep men from the kingdom of God. Remember that the apostle says we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Life is short and the hour of death uncertain. It is wise to be prepared. Remember that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of God. Confess your sins, show penitence, give alms, and the Lord will be merciful. As he entered his last years, Charlemagne donated most of his wealth to the church, including his gold, jewelry, and garments. The bounty went to archbishops in his realm, alms for the poor, and palace servants. Only 1/12 of his wealth was bequeathed to his heirs. Although he was almost crippled from gout and suffering recurrent fevers, Charlemagne began to prepare his only remaining son, Louis, for the crown, teaching him not only how to govern, but how to live. Then he called a great national assembly, attended by every prominent person in the empire, and proposed that Louis be elected emperor. The proposal was unanimously approved. At the coronation of his son in September of the year 813, Charlemagne dressed himself in the imperial gold robes that he seldom wore, and bowed with Louis before the royal altar of the great octagonal church he'd built. He preached to Louis about his duties as emperor, advising him to love and fear God, to protect the church, be kind to his kin, honor the priests, love the common people, help widows and orphans and the poor, and be just to all men. Then he placed the crown upon Louis's head, now his co-emperor, and both men wept. The coronation of his son was Charlemagne's last public act. He recovered his health briefly and spent the entire next month hunting. But the winter was unusually harsh, and he developed one of his fevers. He tried to treat it himself with fasting, as was his habit, but it soon developed into pleurisy, and he died a week later on January 28, 814, at the age of 71. He was entombed in the church he'd built, under an inscription that called him the great and orthodox emperor who had nobly increased the kingdom of the Franks. That kingdom was already disintegrating a generation later, weakened by the greed of the nobles whom Louis lacked the strength to control, by the fighting among Louis's own sons for power, and by assaults by the Vikings. Although the empire established by Charlemagne didn't last, many of his other achievements did. He's renowned not just for the territories he claimed, but for his contributions to society and the culture of Europe. He established colonies in uninhabited lands on the continent, promoted growth of towns and trade, built roads and inns, revived commercial life, and stimulated the arts and learning. His sons and grandsons who became rulers continued his tradition of inviting scholars, poets, and philosophers to their courts. For centuries later, the fame of Frankish scholars continued, so that other countries often sent for teachers from Frankland when they wanted to build their own educational systems. Some have even claimed that Charlemagne, with the help of Alcuin, laid the basis for all modern education. Many of the schools they founded or developed went on to become the great universities of Europe. Because of the improvements in travel and safety on his roads, and because of his support of intellectuals and artists, some of the most talented and creative men of Charlemagne's time found their way to the cities of France and Germany, from places such as Rome, Constantinople, and even Baghdad. The result was a mingling of ideas and skills that dramatically advanced the culture of medieval Europe. The arts, science, and literature were in a feeble state when Charlemagne came to power. Within 50 years, he had accomplished a revival of learning that completely transformed his society. He also expanded and unified his realm, created an empire where church and state worked harmoniously together, and spread Roman Christianity across Central Europe. Because of these accomplishments, he was a man who became a legend. There were books, paintings, sculptures, coins, and poems that glorified him for many years to come. Soon he was the greatest of all crusaders, the most just of judges, the bravest of knights, the most benevolent of lords. His reign became known as the Golden Age of Charlemagne. After his death, there were many emperors and kings who tried to duplicate what he'd done and create a unified Christian empire once again. They never succeeded. But the reign of Charlemagne remained an ideal throughout the Middle Ages, and even longer. Napoleon called himself Charlemagne's successor, and after the end of World War II, discussions about a united Christian Europe were based on his model. Even today, if a unified Europe were to arise, it would geographically be almost an exact duplicate of the empire of Charlemagne, Charles I, the greatest ruler of the Middle Ages.